The shells were whistling in. Major Suresh Kumar, a Fijian peacekeeper with the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, heard that sound first, the distinct high-pitched scream of incoming artillery that every soldier learns to recognize and fear. He was standing in the courtyard of the UNIFIL compound at Qana on April 18, 1996, surrounded by over 800 Lebanese civilians who believed the white UN flag flying above them meant sanctuary. Women clutched infants against their bodies. Elderly men sat on blankets spread across the dirt. Children had been playing between parked UN vehicles just moments before. The first shell impacted 30 meters from the main building, sending up a fountain of earth and shrapnel. Kumar shouted a warning in Arabic, but there was nowhere to run. The compound was packed wall to wall with families who'd fled the Israeli bombardment of southern Lebanon. The second shell hit closer, then the third. Kumar threw himself against a concrete wall as the barrage intensified, each explosion louder and nearer than the last. Through the smoke and the screaming, through the chaos of bodies trying to reach shelter that didn't exist, he could still see that UN flag above the carnage. This was supposed to be a protected zone. The compound had been a UN battalion headquarters for 18 years, clearly marked on every Israeli military map. But the artillery battery firing those shells believed they were covering an Israeli commando unit under attack. They believed they were shooting at a Hezbollah mortar position. They weren't. Before we find out how this catastrophe unfolded, how intelligence failures and split-second decisions led to 106 civilians dying inside what should have been sanctuary, I need to tell you what this channel does. We bring you real intelligence operations every single day. Not Hollywood scripts, not speculation, but actual covert campaigns with genuine tradecraft, the human cost behind military decisions, and the gray zones where operational necessity collides with international law. If you're fascinated by Middle East conflicts, intelligence operations that shaped modern warfare, and the impossible choices that define asymmetric combat, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear about Operation Grapes of Wrath will show you how 16 days of miscalculation, political pressure, and communication breakdowns created one of the most controversial incidents in modern Israeli military history, an incident that would later help radicalize figures like Mohammed Atta and influence Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against the United States. And real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from right now. Drop a comment below with your city and country. Are you in Beirut, Tel Aviv, London, New York, somewhere completely unexpected? Let me know where these intelligence operation stories are reaching. It's always amazing to see the global community that forms around real espionage history. Now, back to how we arrived at that moment of carnage at Qana. We need to rewind 8 days to April 10th, when an Israeli Special Forces team executed what Mossad handlers classified as a textbook assassination in the Lebanese coastal city of Sidon. The target was a mid-level Hezbollah commander whose name appeared on multiple Israeli intelligence watch lists. The hit itself went exactly as planned. 3 operatives, suppressed weapons, vehicle extraction within 4 minutes. But what Israeli intelligence catastrophically miscalculated was Hezbollah's response timeline and intensity. Within 6 hours, Katyusha rockets were screaming across the border into northern Israel. Kiryat Shmona absorbed the first barrage. 18 rockets slammed into residential neighborhoods, wounding 9 civilians and destroying an apartment building's entire 3rd floor. Then Metula took hits, then Nahariya. By midnight on April 10th, Hezbollah had launched over 40 rockets across the border, and Israeli Northern Command was in emergency session trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make Prime Minister Shimon Peres look weak. Peres was facing elections in less than 2 months, and his political opponent Benjamin Netanyahu was already on television in Kiryat Shmona saying that a city-absorbing rocket fire with no Israeli response was simply impossible, that this had to be stopped immediately. The Israeli public was demanding protection, demanding action, demanding that their government do something decisive. The military presented Peres with 3 options at that midnight meeting: Limited strikes on known Hezbollah positions, expanded operations targeting command infrastructure, or a full-scale campaign designed to pressure not just Hezbollah, but the Lebanese and Syrian governments that enabled them. Paris chose option 3. By dawn on April 11th, Operation Grapes of Wrath was underway, and the name itself carried biblical weight, God's wrath being poured out on his enemies. The irony of an Israeli military operation named after Christian religious doctrine wasn't lost on Israeli journalists, though most commentators either believed the title referenced the Torah or simply nodded to John Steinbeck's famous novel. But the theological implications mattered less than the operational objective, which Israeli officials stated clearly from the beginning: stop Hezbollah's rocket attacks on northern Israel by any means necessary. The actual execution would prove far more complicated than anyone in Tel Aviv anticipated, because Israeli intelligence had identified over 300 suspected Hezbollah rocket launch sites scattered across southern Lebanon. Many were positioned in villages, near homes, inside the civilian infrastructure that made southern Lebanon a patchwork of legitimate targets and protected zones. Hitting all 300 sites would require devastating firepower applied across a wide area. Israeli Air Force F-16S launched the first strikes at 6 in the morning on April 11th, hitting weapons depots and suspected command posts with precision-guided munitions. Israeli Navy vessels established a blockade along the Lebanese coast, interdicting any ships approaching the ports of Beirut, Sidon, and Tyre, and the artillery batteries positioned just inside Lebanon's border began a bombardment campaign that would continue for 16 consecutive days, firing 25,000 shells into Lebanese territory. But Israel also launched something else that morning: a psychological warfare operation specifically designed to empty southern Lebanon of its civilian population. Israeli aircraft dropped thousands of leaflets over dozens of Shiite villages, printed in Arabic with messages that mixed warning and threat. The leaflet said to leave immediately, that the IDF would strike Hezbollah positions in your area, that remaining meant accepting responsibility for your own death. Some leaflets included crude maps showing suggested evacuation routes north toward Beirut. Israeli radio broadcast from the Voice of the South repeated the warnings every hour. Then, on April 14th, Israeli officials made their position even more explicit in a broadcast that would later be cited by human rights organizations as a violation of international humanitarian law. The broadcast stated that following the warnings to 45 villages, any presence in these villages would be considered terrorist presence, meaning the terrorists and all those with them would be hit. Any civilian who remained in the villages would do so on their own responsibility and would put their life in danger. The message was clear, brutal, and effective. Within 48 hours, over 200,000 Lebanese civilians were fleeing north, clogging the roads with cars, trucks, tractors, donkey carts, and families carrying whatever possessions they could manage on their backs. By the end of the first week, that number would exceed 300,000 people displaced from their homes. Among those fleeing were tobacco farmers who watched their annual harvest wither in the fields, families who'd survived the chaos since 1975, and elderly people who remembered when southern Lebanon wasn't a battlefield. Many headed for UN compounds, believing that the blue flag and international protection would keep them safe from the bombardment. The UNIFIL base at Qana became one of the largest gathering points. By April 14th, 745 people were sheltering there. By April 18th, that number would exceed 800. Inside Hezbollah's operational structure, the Israeli escalation triggered an immediate tactical adaptation. The organization's military wing had spent years developing mobile rocket teams specifically designed to survive Israeli airstrikes and artillery barrages. Each team consisted of 3 to 5 fighters with a pickup truck, a Katyusha launcher, and a predetermined firing position. The entire sequence from setup to launch to breakdown took less than 10 minutes. Drive to the position, set up the launcher, fire the rockets, dismantle everything, drive to a new location miles away. This fire and relocate doctrine was purpose-built to defeat Israeli signals, intelligence, and precision targeting. And in the first 72 hours of Operation Grapes of Wrath, it was working better than Israeli commanders wanted to admit. Israeli SIGINT units stationed along the border used triangulation methods to pinpoint Hezbollah radio transmissions, feeding real-time coordinates to artillery batteries and helicopter gunships for immediate strikes. The theory was straightforward: intercept the transmission, calculate the origin point, saturate the area with high explosive shells before the team could relocate. But Hezbollah communication specialists had studied Israeli methods during the 1993 Operation Accountability and developed countermeasures. They broadcast multiple short-burst transmissions from different locations, creating false signals that drew Israeli artillery fire to empty fields and abandoned buildings. They used decoy equipment that mimicked the electronic signature of actual command posts. They moved constantly, never transmitting from the same position twice. Israeli commanders called them ghost signals, deliberate misinformation designed to waste ammunition and create the illusion of a larger Hezbollah presence across southern Lebanon than actually existed. One Israeli SIGINT operator later admitted to researchers that during the first week of Operation Grapes of Wrath, nearly 40% of their targeting data was essentially chasing phantoms. But the real Hezbollah rocket teams kept firing. By April 13th, over 100 Katyusha rockets had hit northern Israel, causing significant property damage, destroying homes, forcing thousands of Israelis into bomb shelters for days at a time. The Israeli public was growing increasingly impatient and angry. Operation Grapes of Wrath was supposed to stop the rockets, but the rockets kept coming at the same rate or higher. Israeli military leadership faced a dilemma that would define the operation's trajectory. They could intensify the bombardment, hitting more targets with less discrimination, accepting higher civilian casualties in exchange for potentially degrading Hezbollah's capabilities. Or they could acknowledge that mobile guerrilla rocket teams operating from civilian areas were nearly impossible to neutralize through conventional firepower alone. They chose intensification. April 14th marked the expansion phase. Israeli officials made another radio broadcast that Human Rights Watch would later cite as evidence of intentional attacks on civilians. The broadcast announced that the Israeli army would intensify activities against terrorists, that any presence in the warned villages would be considered terrorist presence, and that those who remained would be hit. Israeli Air Force strikes began hitting targets deeper inside Lebanon. Power stations in Tyre that Israeli intelligence claimed supported Hezbollah logistics, suspected political offices in Nabatea, telecommunications infrastructure that might facilitate Hezbollah coordination. Helicopter gunships prowled southern Lebanon skies day and night, hunting for the thermal signatures of rocket launchers or the movement patterns of armed men. Israeli artillery batteries fired thousands of shells daily, creating what military planners called pressure corridors, zones of sustained bombardment intended to make Hezbollah operations physically impossible. But with every expansion of the target list, Lebanese civilian casualties increased. Hospitals in Tyre and Sidon were filling with wounded civilians, many of them women and children who'd been caught in strikes on buildings that Israeli intelligence believed housed Hezbollah fighters or weapons. The international media was beginning to pay close attention. CNN had crews in both northern Israel and southern Lebanon, broadcasting footage of rocket impacts in Israeli towns, alongside images of Lebanese civilian casualties. The narrative was becoming problematic for Israel. Hezbollah rockets causing property damage in Israel, Israeli strikes causing civilian deaths in Lebanon. The asymmetry of the casualty figures was stark. No Israeli civilians had died yet, though several had been seriously wounded. But Lebanese civilian deaths were climbing past 50, then 70, then 100. The United Nations peacekeeping force in Lebanon found itself in an impossible position that would soon become catastrophic. UNIFIL's mandate was to monitor the border region and provide humanitarian assistance, but they were now operating in an active war zone where neither side seemed particularly concerned about international law or protected zones. UNIFIL commanders began filing urgent reports to UN headquarters in New York, documenting the intensity of Israeli shelling and its dangerous proximity to their positions. On April 15th, a UNIFIL observation post recorded Israeli artillery fire landing within 200 meters of their compound at Qana. The report specifically noted that the number of Lebanese civilians seeking shelter at UN positions was growing exponentially, that families believed the blue UN flag would protect them from the bombardment. One report stated that over 700 civilians were now at Qana, with more arriving every hour. Those reports were transmitted through official UN channels to the Israeli Defense Forces Liaison Office at Northern Command. The question of whether they reached the artillery commanders actually making targeting decisions would become central to the controversy that followed. UNIFIL commanders would later testify that they made multiple phone calls to IDF liaison officers, specifically informing them that thousands of civilians were sheltering in UN compounds across southern Lebanon. The head of IDF intelligence, Major General Moshe Ya'alon, would later confirm on CNN that Israel was fully aware civilians were sheltering in UN bases. The director of Israeli artillery, Brigadier General Dan Harel, would confirm that UNIFIL had informed the IDF just 2 days before the Qana incident that between 5,000 and 9,000 refugees were sheltering in UNIFIL bases in the area. UNIFIL spokesperson Timur Göksel would tell journalists that he personally informed IDF liaison officers about the civilian presence at Qana. But somehow, this information didn't translate into protected zones on Israeli artillery maps. The shells kept falling near UN positions. The warnings kept being transmitted and apparently ignored. And the civilians kept arriving at Qana, believing that international protection meant something in a war zone where both sides were operating with an apparent disregard for the laws of armed conflict. By April 16th, Hezbollah demonstrated something that genuinely shocked Israeli intelligence analysts. They fired Katyusha rockets that struck targets 15 kilometers inside Israel, well beyond what IDF assessments had predicted was Hezbollah's maximum range capability. This wasn't just a tactical surprise. It was a strategic revelation that forced an immediate reassessment of Israel's entire security buffer concept. If Hezbollah could hit deeper into Israeli territory than intelligence estimates suggested, then the security zone Israel maintained in southern Lebanon was providing less protection than military planners believed. The psychological impact on Israeli civilians was significant. Towns that thought they were safely outside Hezbollah's range suddenly found themselves under threat. Israeli Northern Command requested and received expanded authority to strike suspected Hezbollah weapons storage facilities and command centers, even when those targets were located in densely populated areas. The gloves were coming off. April 17th became the heaviest day of bombardment yet. Israeli artillery fired over 2,000 shell into southern Lebanon in a 24-hour period. Hezbollah responded with their largest single-day rocket barrage of the entire operation, 67 Katyushas landing across northern Israel, including several that struck Kiryat Shmona's central market district during afternoon shopping hours, injuring 14 civilians and causing panic that spread through every town within rocket range. The violence was escalating on both sides, creating a dynamic that neither side seemed able or willing to control. The diplomatic pressure was intensifying as well. U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher was already planning a shuttle diplomacy mission to the region. The UN Security Council had scheduled an emergency session. France was making diplomatic overtures to both Israel and Syria, which everyone understood controlled Hezbollah's strategic decisions, even if Damascus maintained the fiction of Hezbollah independence. But nobody on either side was ready to blink yet. Israeli military leadership believed they were close to breaking Hezbollah's operational capacity, that just a few more days of sustained pressure would force Hezbollah to pull back from the border. Hezbollah leadership believed they were demonstrating deterrence capability that would force Israel to negotiate from a position of weakness. Both sides were fundamentally miscalculating the other's resolve and the international community's tolerance for civilian casualties. That evening, an Israeli unmanned aerial vehicle conducting reconnaissance over southern Lebanon, transmitted thermal imaging footage to an intelligence analysis cell at Northern Command headquarters. The analysts were examining heat signatures near the village of Qana, trying to determine whether they were observing a Hezbollah rocket team or simply civilian movement in an area where civilians should have evacuated. Thermal imaging creates inherently ambiguous pictures, especially in complex terrain. Hot engines, campfires, human bodies clustered together, they all appear as bright spots on a grayscale screen. Two intelligence analysts examined the same footage that evening. One believed he was seeing a Hezbollah technical vehicle with a mounted launcher, citing the heat signature's size and the movement pattern that seemed tactical rather than random. The other analyst wasn't convinced, noting that the movement didn't match known Hezbollah operational protocols and that the area was known to have civilians despite the evacuation warnings. The imagery was classified as probable enemy position, a designation that meant target with caution, but target nonetheless. The coordinates were added to the target list for the next day's operations, entered into the fire control system as a location where Hezbollah might be operating. What neither analyst knew, what nobody in the Israeli targeting chain apparently knew or acted upon, was that those coordinates placed the suspected position within 500 meters of the UNIFIL compound at Qana, where over 800 Lebanese civilians were sheltering in what they believed was UN-protected sanctuary. The compound had been a UN battalion headquarters for 18 years. It was clearly marked on Israeli military maps with UN insignia. UNIFIL had filed multiple reports about the massive civilian presence there, but somehow the dots weren't connecting between the intelligence analysts identifying targets and the artillery commanders who would be ordered to fire at those targets the next day. April 18th began with sustained Hezbollah rocket fire across the border. At 11 in the morning, a significant salvo of Katyushas hit the outskirts of Kiryat Shmona, Israeli radar tracking the launch origin to an area south of Qana. Somewhere in that general vicinity, Hezbollah fighters had set up a mortar position in a cemetery approximately 170 meters from the UNIFIL compound. This was classic Hezbollah tactics: position weapons near sites that Israel might hesitate to strike, fire quickly, and relocate before retaliation arrives. The mortar team fired between 5 and 8 rounds at an Israeli commando unit operating inside Lebanon. Then, according to eyewitnesses, some of the fighters ran toward the UNIFIL compound and took refuge there, possibly believing the UN presence would protect them from Israeli counterfire. The Israeli commando unit taking mortar fire was commanded by a 24-year-old captain named Naftali Bennett, leading 67 soldiers from the elite Maglan reconnaissance unit. They'd been operating behind Hezbollah lines for 8 days, hunting for rocket launchers and fighters, conducting the kind of deep reconnaissance missions that special forces units specialize in. When the mortar rounds started landing near his position, Bennett radioed for immediate fire support. He was under attack, his unit was exposed, and standard Israeli doctrine called for rapid counter-battery fire to suppress enemy positions. The call went to an Israeli artillery battery positioned just inside Lebanon, 4 guns, 155mm howitzers, the kind of heavy artillery that fires high-explosive shells designed to saturate an area rather than hit a precise point. The artillery battery commander received authorization to conduct counter-battery fire against the suspected mortar position. The coordinates he received were based partly on radar tracking of the mortar round's trajectory, partly on Bennett's radio transmission describing where he believed the fire was coming from, and possibly on that ambiguous UAV footage from the previous evening. Artillery targeting isn't precision work, especially not counter-battery fire conducted at speed to protect troops in contact. It's area suppression. You saturate the suspected enemy position with enough explosive force that nothing survives, accepting that the margin of error might be hundreds of meters. The battery commander ordered a full fire mission, 36 shells, high explosive rounds with proximity fuses designed to detonate above ground, maximizing fragmentation effects against personnel. At 2:07 in the afternoon, the first shells began landing near Qana. Major Suresh Kumar was in the UNIFIL compound courtyard, distributing water to civilian families from a truck that had arrived that morning when he heard the incoming rounds. His first instinct was to get everyone into the concrete building at the compound's center. But there were too many people and not enough time. The first shell landed in an open field 30 meters from the compound perimeter, sending up a plume of dirt and shrapnel that peppered the outer wall. Kumar started shouting in Arabic for people to get down, to find cover, to move toward the building, but panic spreads faster than orders. Mothers grabbed their children and ran for the entrance. Elderly men tried to move faster than their bodies would allow. Then, the second shell hit, closer this time, impacting just outside the compound's southern fence. The barrage intensified rapidly. Shell after shell, the Israeli artillery battery was walking its fire across the target area, adjusting based on the fall of shot, saturating the zone with high explosive rounds. Standard counter-battery procedure. You don't fire one shell and wait to see where it lands. You fire a barrage pattern designed to cover the entire suspected position. One shell hit the compound's southwest corner, shredding the chain-link fence and sending metal fragments through the crowd of civilians trying to reach shelter. Another shell landed inside the compound itself, exploding among the families clustered near the building's entrance. Kumar saw a Lebanese woman thrown backward by the blast wave, her body crumpling against a UN vehicle. He saw a child's shoe lying in the dirt, still smoking from the heat of the explosion. The screaming was constant, mixing with the whistle of incoming shells and the concussive thunder of each impact. 1 minute into the barrage, UNIFIL officers inside the compound's command post managed to get through by telephone to IDF liaison officers. They screamed into the phone that Israeli artillery was shelling their compound, that they had 800 civilians inside, that they needed the firing to stop immediately. The Israeli officers on the other end said they would relay the message. The shelling continued for 16 more minutes, 17 minutes total. 36 shells fired by a 4-gun battery, and while none of them hit the cemetery where the Hezbollah mortar team had fired from, 11 shells landed directly inside the UNIFIL compound. The cluster pattern of impacts would later be analyzed by UN investigators and military experts, who would conclude that the pattern was inconsistent with erratic fire or technical malfunction. The shells that hit the compound landed in a tight grouping that suggested deliberate targeting or, at minimum, continued fire after the first shells revealed that the target was not where the coordinates indicated. When the barrage finally stopped, the compound looked like an abattoir. Bodies were scattered across the courtyard. Men, women, children, entire families cut down by shrapnel from proximity-fused rounds specifically designed to maximize casualties against personnel. The wounded screamed for help that UNIFIL peacekeepers were scrambling to provide with medical supplies meant for minor injuries, not mass casualty events. Blood pooled in the dirt, the smell of high explosives mixed with the smell of torn flesh and burned fabric. Fijian peacekeepers tried to perform triage, separating those who might survive with immediate treatment from those who were clearly dead or dying. 106 civilians were killed in those 17 minutes. 116 more were wounded, many critically. 4 UNIFIL peacekeepers were seriously injured. More than half the dead were children. Within 90 minutes, the first journalist arrived. Robert Fisk of The Independent was among them, driving south from Beirut, despite the ongoing bombardment. CNN had a camera crew filming the aftermath by 4 in the afternoon. The footage went global immediately, broadcast on evening news programs across the world, bodies being carried out of the compound, wrapped in blankets, wounded children in the arms of blood-soaked peacekeepers, the UN flag still flying above the carnage, and in the background, the cemetery where the Hezbollah mortar position had been, completely untouched by the artillery barrage that had devastated the compound 500 meters away. The Israeli government issued a statement within hours, claiming the artillery fire was legitimate counter-battery targeting in response to Hezbollah mortar attacks from the vicinity of the UN compound. Israeli officials stated that Hezbollah was using the compound as a shield, positioning weapons nearby to protect themselves from retaliation. Prime Minister Shimon Peres said it was disgraceful that 800 civilians were living under a tin roof and the United Nations hadn't informed Israel of their presence. UNIFIL commanders immediately contradicted that account, stating they had repeatedly informed Israel about the massive civilian presence at Qana, that they'd seen no Hezbollah firing from within the compound, and that Israeli forces had been warned multiple times about shelling near their positions in the days before the attack. The global condemnation was instantaneous, severe, and sustained. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session within hours of the massacre. European governments issued statements demanding an immediate ceasefire and investigation. Arab governments called it a war crime. Even the United States, Israel's closest ally, described the incident as a tragedy and accelerated diplomatic efforts to end the operation. But Hezbollah's response was perhaps the most strategically significant. They increased their rocket attacks. The day after Qana, Hezbollah fired 73 rockets into northern Israel, the highest single-day total of the entire operation. The message was unmistakable. International outrage over Qana had given Hezbollah both moral justification and tactical cover to escalate further. They were no longer just the resistance fighting occupation. They were the victims of Israeli brutality, and every rocket they fired could be framed as justified retaliation. Inside Israel, the political calculus shifted with brutal speed. Prime Minister Peres was facing an election in less than 2 months, and Qana had just become his defining liability. His political opponents were already framing the massacre as proof that the operation was poorly planned, recklessly executed, and strategically counterproductive. His supporters in the military were insisting the targeting was legitimate, that Hezbollah bore ultimate responsibility for operating near civilians. But the images from Qana were devastating. Children's bodies pulled from rubble inside a clearly marked UN compound, peacekeepers carrying the dead wrapped in blood-soaked UN flags. No amount of tactical justification could overcome those images in the court of public opinion. Within 24 hours, Peres quietly signaled through diplomatic channels that Israel was prepared to discuss a ceasefire framework. The operation that was supposed to break Hezbollah's will had instead broken Israel's international standing and Peres' domestic political position. Warren Christopher, the U.S. Secretary of State, arrived in the region on April 19th and began the most intensive shuttle diplomacy of his career. His mission was deceptively simple: get both sides to stop shooting before the situation escalated into a regional war that might draw in Syria directly. But simple and easy are different things. His challenge was constructing a ceasefire framework that both Israel and Hezbollah could accept without appearing to surrender or lose face. Christopher flew between Jerusalem, Beirut, and Damascus, carrying proposals and counterproposals, trying to find language that both sides could live with. The fundamental problem was mutual distrust. Israel didn't believe Hezbollah would honor any agreement. Hezbollah didn't believe Israel would stop attacking Lebanese civilians, and neither side wanted to be seen backing down under international pressure rather than achieving their military objectives. Syria held the key to unlocking the diplomatic stalemate. Hezbollah operated with Syrian support, coordination, and restraint. Damascus had significant influence over the organization's strategic decisions, even if Syria maintained the public fiction of Hezbollah's independence. Syrian President Hafez al-Assad was playing a sophisticated game with Christopher. He appeared to be working toward a ceasefire, making helpful suggestions and applying subtle pressure on Hezbollah. But Assad's actual strategy was more calculating. He wanted to maximize Syria's leverage in any final agreement, which meant allowing Hezbollah to continue fighting long enough to demonstrate that Syrian cooperation was absolutely essential for peace. Assad was willing to let Lebanese civilians die if it increased Syria's bargaining position with both Israel and the United States. I have to pause here and ask you something important. If you were the artillery commander who received the call for fire support from that Israeli commando unit under mortar attack near Qana, knowing you had soldiers in danger but also knowing that UNIFIL had warned about 800 civilians sheltering nearby, do you authorize the fire mission or do you hold back? There's no clean answer here. Authorizing the strike risks exactly what happened: massive civilian casualties if your targeting data is wrong. But refusing fire support means Israeli soldiers under attack might die because you hesitated. It's the kind of impossible choice that defines warfare in civilian areas, where perfect intelligence doesn't exist and split-second decisions have permanent consequences. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this question goes beyond Qana. It defines how modern militaries fight insurgent organizations that operate from civilian zones, and there's no doctrine that resolves this moral equation cleanly. Here's what happened during those 8 days of shuttle diplomacy. Both sides continued tactical operations designed to maximize their leverage before the ceasefire took effect. Israel conducted selective strikes on high-value targets, suspected Hezbollah commanders, major weapons depots, anything that might degrade capabilities before the shooting stopped. Hezbollah maintained rocket pressure on northern Israel, demonstrating that their capability was intact despite 16 days of bombardment. Israeli commanders had a term for this: positioning fire. You shoot to improve your negotiating position before the ceasefire freezes everything in place. Hezbollah did exactly the same thing. On April 25th, just 2 days before the ceasefire, Hezbollah fired 60 rockets into Israel in a single afternoon. The next day, Israel conducted airstrikes on suspected command centers in Tyre. Both sides were making final tactical moves, while diplomats worked frantically to construct an agreement. Behind the scenes, Arab Gulf states were applying their own pressure through channels that rarely make headlines. The United Arab Emirates and Qatar quietly used backdoor communications to Washington, emphasizing that continued violence in Lebanon was destabilizing the entire region, that American credibility in the Arab world was suffering with every civilian death shown on Al Jazeera and other Arab media outlets. This additional pressure, combined with European diplomatic efforts, helped accelerate the final negotiations. Christopher worked with French diplomats to construct what would become known as the April Understanding, an informal ceasefire agreement that neither side would actually sign, but both sides agreed to honor through third-party monitoring. The terms were carefully worded to give both sides room to claim they hadn't surrendered. Hezbollah would not fire rockets into Israel targeting civilian areas. Israel would not attack Lebanese civilian zones. Both sides retained the right to engage in military operations against each other, but those operations could not deliberately target non-combatants or be launched from civilian areas. Any violations would be reviewed by a monitoring group composed of representatives from the United States, France, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It was an imperfect agreement that left enormous room for interpretation and dispute. What exactly constituted a civilian area? Who determined whether an attack was deliberate versus collateral damage? How would the monitoring group enforce compliance when neither side respected international humanitarian law? But imperfect agreements that stop the killing are better than perfect frameworks that exist only on paper. On April 27th, Operation Grapes of Wrath officially ended. The ceasefire took effect at 4 a.m, and for the first time in 17 days, the sound of artillery and rockets faded. The final casualty count was devastating and asymmetric. Between 154 and 170 Lebanese civilians were dead, most killed by Israeli artillery and airstrikes. Over 300,000 had been displaced from their homes. Infrastructure across southern Lebanon was damaged or destroyed. Power stations, roads, bridges, telecommunications towers, civilian homes. On the Israeli side, 0 civilians had been killed, though several had been seriously wounded. Property damage from over 639 Katyusha rockets was significant, but not catastrophic. 3 Israeli soldiers had died during the operation, but the strategic outcome was even more problematic for Israel than the casualty figure suggested. Hezbollah's rocket capability was essentially intact despite 17 days of bombardment and over 25,000 artillery shells fired into southern Lebanon. The organization's mobile launch teams had proven resilient enough to continue operations throughout the campaign, adapting to Israeli tactics faster than Israeli forces could adapt to theirs. Politically, Hezbollah emerged stronger inside Lebanon. The images from Qana had transformed them from controversial resistance movement to victims of Israeli aggression in the eyes of many Lebanese who'd previously been ambivalent about Hezbollah's military activities. Internationally, Israel's standing had taken a severe hit, with the Qana massacre becoming the defining image of the operation, overshadowing any military objectives achieved. The internal Israeli military reviews that followed were mostly classified, but elements have leaked over the years through journalists and former officers willing to speak on condition of anonymity. One review acknowledged that the SIGINT triangulation methods used to locate Hezbollah rocket teams had been far less effective than anticipated. Hezbollah's decoy communications and rapid relocation tactics had caused significant targeting errors, with Israeli artillery firing repeatedly at empty positions. Another review examined the Qana incident specifically, and this is where the story gets even darker. The review noted that the UAV footage used to help justify the artillery strike was technically ambiguous. Analysts had disagreed on what they were seeing, but the decision to fire had been made anyway, under the pressure of supporting Israeli soldiers in contact with the enemy. The review also confirmed what UNIFIL had been saying all along, that multiple warnings about civilian presence at Qana had been transmitted to Israeli forces in the 72 hours before the shelling, but those warnings had not been properly integrated into the artillery targeting procedures. The communication failure that led to Qana was systemic, not the fault of any single individual, but the result of an operational tempo that prioritized speed of response over verification of targets. But there was more. Israeli journalist Robert Fisk obtained and published video evidence that fundamentally contradicted Israel's initial claims about Qana. A UNIFIL soldier had secretly recorded footage showing an Israeli reconnaissance drone circling above the compound before, during, and after the shelling. Israel had initially and repeatedly denied that any drone was in the area, claiming they had no way of knowing civilians were sheltering at the compound. When Fisk published the video stills in The Independent, Israel changed its story. Suddenly, they admitted there was a drone in the area, but claimed it was on a different mission, that it hadn't detected civilians in the compound. But the existence of that drone raised devastating questions. If Israeli forces had aerial surveillance over Qana during the shelling, they could see where their shells were landing. They could see that the compound was packed with people. They could see that the artillery fire wasn't hitting the cemetery where the mortar team had been. Yet the barrage continued for 17 minutes, 11 shells landing inside the compound after the first impacts revealed it was the wrong target. The UN investigation, conducted by Dutch Major General Franklin van Kappen, concluded that while the possibility of technical error couldn't be ruled out completely, it was unlikely that the shelling was the result of gross technical or procedural errors. The implication was clear. The shelling appeared deliberate. Israel categorically rejected the UN report's findings, maintaining that the artillery fire was legitimate counter-battery action, that Hezbollah's use of civilian areas as shields made such tragedies inevitable, and that any deaths at Qana were ultimately Hezbollah's responsibility. But documents that emerged later complicated that narrative further. In May of 1996, the Israeli weekly newspaper Kol Ha'ir published interviews with several members of the artillery battery that fired on Qana. The soldiers spoke anonymously, but their accounts were disturbing. One artilleryman, identified only as the soldier A, said his commander had encouraged them after the attack, telling them it was war, that Arabs fire at you, so what can you do? That they'd been firing well and should keep it up. He added that Arabs, you know there are millions of them. Another soldier, Soldier T, said nobody spoke about it as if it was a mistake, that they did their job and were at peace with that even their sergeant told them they were great, and the victims were just a bunch of Arabs, using the Hebrew slur Arabushim. The soldier added, how many Arabs are there and how many Jews? A few die, and there's no harm in that. These accounts suggested something darker than technical error or communication failure. They suggested a level of dehumanization of Arab civilians that made mass casualties not just acceptable, but unremarkable to the soldiers pulling the lanyards on those artillery pieces. UNIFIL's investigation was more direct than the UN's diplomatic language. Their report documented that Israeli forces had been warned repeatedly about the civilian presence at Qana. It noted that the Israeli military had fired on UN positions 242 times during Operation Grapes of Wrath, suggesting a pattern of either reckless disregard for UN-protected zones or deliberate targeting. It specifically stated that UNIFIL had called the IDF just 1 minute into the Qana barrage, informing them they were shelling a UN compound with 800 civilians inside, yet the firing continued for 16 more minutes. The legal and moral questions raised by Qana have never been fully resolved. Was it a war crime, a tragic accident, or a legitimate military operation with unintended consequences that Israel should have foreseen and prevented? The Geneva Conventions prohibit attacks on civilian objects unless they're being used for military purposes, and they require that even legitimate military operations take all feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians. The evidence suggests those precautions were not taken at Qana. UNIFIL's warnings were ignored or never reached the people making targeting decisions. The presence of an Israeli drone suggests Israel had the capability to verify the target, but either didn't use that capability or didn't care what the drone was showing them. The political consequences inside Israel were immediate and severe. Shimon Peres lost the 1996 election to Benjamin Netanyahu by a margin of less than 30,000 votes. Political analysts attributed the loss partly to Palestinian citizens of Israel, who typically voted for Labor Party candidates like Peres, but stayed home or switched votes because of Qana. The massacre had cost Peres the election, making him the political casualty of an operation he'd authorized. The images from Qana became symbolic of military operations gone catastrophically wrong, used by peace advocates to argue for restraint, and by security hawks to argue that half measures never work, that Israel should have either stayed out entirely or gone in with overwhelming force to actually destroy Hezbollah's capabilities. Inside Lebanon, Qana became a rallying point for Hezbollah's narrative of resistance against Israeli aggression. The organization built memorials to the victims and used footage from the massacre in recruitment videos to demonstrate Israeli brutality and the necessity of armed resistance. Lebanese politicians across the political spectrum condemned the attack, even those who privately opposed Hezbollah's military activities and wanted the organization disarmed. Qana made it politically impossible for Lebanese government to pressure Hezbollah, because doing so would look like capitulating to the very Israeli forces that had massacred civilians in a UN compound. In that sense, Operation Grapes of Wrath achieved the opposite of its intended strategic effect. It strengthened Hezbollah politically while failing to degrade their military capabilities significantly. The international legal debates about Qana continued decades later. Human Rights Watch conducted extensive investigation and concluded that the attack was a massacre, intentional in nature, using highly accurate weapon systems. Amnesty International's inquiry found that the attack was intentional and condemned it as a violation of international humanitarian law. But Israel was never held accountable through any international legal mechanism. Survivors of Qana filed a lawsuit in American courts against Lieutenant General Moshe Ya'alon, who'd been head of IDF intelligence during the operation. The United States District Court dismissed the case, ruling that Ya'alon was entitled to immunity under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Justice for the victims of Qana remained elusive, blocked by diplomatic immunity and great power politics. The April understanding brokered by Warren Christopher held, more or less, for the next decade. Rocket attacks from Lebanon into Israel declined significantly, though they never stopped entirely. Hezbollah used the ceasefire period strategically, rebuilding their capabilities and importing more sophisticated weapon systems from Iran and Syria. They developed better training protocols for their fighters, transforming from a guerrilla organization into something that resembled a conventional military force with advanced anti-tank missiles, surface-to-air capabilities, and longer-range rockets. Israeli intelligence monitored this buildup with growing alarm, filing reports that Hezbollah was becoming a more dangerous adversary than they'd been in 1996. Those reports would prove accurate when the next war came in 2006. That conflict would make Operation Grapes of Wrath look small by comparison. Over 1,000 people killed, hundreds of thousands displaced, and the same strategic dynamics repeating on a larger scale. Israeli firepower versus guerrilla mobility. Civilian casualties creating international pressure. Ceasefire agreements that neither side truly honored. The lessons supposedly learned from Qana didn't prevent future tragedies. They just changed the weapons and methods used to inflict them. Syria maintained its influence over Hezbollah throughout the decade following Operation Grapes of Wrath, using the organization as a strategic asset in Syria's broader confrontation with Israel. Damascus allowed Hezbollah enough operational freedom to maintain pressure on Israel and preserve Hezbollah's resistance credentials, but restrained the organization when escalation threatened Syrian interests. This balancing act worked until Syrian priorities shifted dramatically following the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005. The international investigation into Hariri's murder implicated Syrian intelligence, leading to massive protests in Lebanon that forced Syrian military withdrawal after nearly 30 years of occupation. Without direct Syrian oversight in Lebanon, Hezbollah's decision-making became more independent, setting conditions for the 2006 war. The broader consequences of Operation Grapes of Wrath extended far beyond Lebanon's borders in ways Israeli planners never anticipated. Osama bin Laden cited Qana at least 5 times in various statements and interviews as motivation for his actions against the United States. In his August 1996 declaration of jihad, bin Laden specifically mentioned that the horrifying pictures of the Qana massacre were still fresh in memory, that Muslims had suffered aggression and injustice from what he called the Zionist Crusader Alliance. In interviews with journalists including Robert Fisk, bin Laden repeatedly returned to Qana as evidence that the United States enabled and supported Israeli atrocities against Muslim civilians. Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker in the September 11th attacks, was reportedly enraged by Operation Grapes of Wrath. According to Lawrence Wright's book, The Looming Tower, Atta signed his will at the beginning of Operation Grapes of Wrath in April 1996, and according to one of his friends, Atta was offering his life in response to the Israeli operation. The connection between Qana and the radicalization of future terrorists isn't direct or simple, but it's real. Images of Muslim civilians killed by Israeli weapons, enabled by American diplomatic cover and military support, became powerful recruitment tools for extremist organizations. Qana was used to argue that peaceful coexistence with the West was impossible, that only violent resistance could protect Muslim lives. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you for taking this deep dive into one of the most controversial military operations in modern Middle East history. This channel brings you real intelligence operations every single day, covert campaigns that shaped regional conflicts, the tradecraft that determined outcomes, and the human cost behind every strategic decision. We cover everything from Cold War espionage to modern cyber warfare, from Mossad operations to CIA failures, and especially the gray zones where military necessity collides with international law and moral questions that have no easy answers. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now and turn on notifications. The stories we cover aren't entertainment. They're the actual operations that shaped the world we live in today. So, what do you think about Operation Grapes of Wrath? Was it a military failure that achieved none of its strategic objectives, a political disaster that strengthened Israel's enemies, or both? Could Israeli commanders have made different choices that would have stopped Hezbollah's rockets without killing civilians at Qana? Could Hezbollah have maintained its resistance without operating from civilian areas that made those civilians targets? Was the April understanding a genuine framework for peace, or just a pause before the next round of violence? Drop your analysis in the comments below. I read every single comment, and these questions matter because they define how modern conflicts are fought when one side has overwhelming military superiority and the other side uses asymmetric tactics that guarantees civilian suffering. The shells that hit Qana on April 18th killed 106 people in 17 minutes, but the decisions that led to those shells being fired were made over weeks, months, and years. They were made in the doctrine that says counter-battery fire must be immediate to protect soldiers in contact. They were made in the intelligence assessments that classified ambiguous thermal signatures as probable enemy positions. They were made in the communication systems that failed to integrate UN warnings into targeting protocols. They were made in the political calculations that prioritized demonstrating strength over protecting civilians. They were made in the strategic framework that treated Lebanese civilian displacement as acceptable psychological warfare. Operation Grapes of Wrath wasn't a 16-day aberration or an isolated incident. It was the culmination of systemic problems in how Israel and Hezbollah fought each other, how intelligence informed military action with insufficient verification, and how civilians always pay the price when those systems fail catastrophically. Understanding this isn't about assigning blame to one side or the other exclusively, though both sides made choices that led directly to civilian deaths. It's about recognizing that wars fought in civilian areas with imperfect intelligence and political constraints create impossible choices that guarantee tragedy. Qana was inevitable the moment Operation Grapes of Wrath began, with the explicit strategy of displacing civilians to pressure governments. It was inevitable when Hezbollah positioned mortars near a UN compound, knowing Israel would fire back. It was inevitable when Israeli artillery commanders received orders to provide immediate fire support without adequate time to verify targets. And until the fundamental calculations change, until military commanders value civilian life above tactical advantage, until guerrilla organizations stop using civilian presence as operational cover, until international law has actual enforcement mechanisms rather than just diplomatic condemnation, there will be more operations like Grapes of Wrath, more compounds like Qana, and more families who believed a UN flag would protect them from the violence that humans inflict on each other in the name of security, resistance, and national interest. That's not cynicism. It's the pattern demonstrated by 30 years of conflict in Lebanon and Gaza. The weapons get more sophisticated, the intelligence gets more precise, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. And that's the real lesson of Operation Grapes of Wrath that nobody seems willing to learn.